Welcome again to the fourth webinar in our Power of Social Innovation series. Today's webinar, The Mandate and Caution of Engaging Government, is sponsored by the Ash Center's Government Innovators Network and the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. Before I pass the floor over to Professor Wilson, we have some polling questions that we would like you, the audience, to fill out that will help make all of our remarks as relevant as possible. So I'll leave each question up for a few moments. Please feel free to just click on the little circle to the left of your response. Okay, I'm going to close this question in a few seconds. Next question, what type of work are you involved in? Okay, I'm going to close in a few more seconds. Last question, just so we can gauge how many people have joined us today. Okay, let's get started. Please allow me to introduce Professor Julie Boatwright Wilson. Professor Wilson is a well-regarded expert here at the Harvard Kennedy School in a number of disciplines ranging from poverty and family policy to urban race relations. Among Professor Wilson's recent projects are studies on the historical development of poor neighborhoods, on adoption, and on community-based strategies for strengthening families. Professor Wilson is not just familiar with today's topic from a scholarly perspective, as she has also spent 3 years at the New York State Department of Social Services, where she directed the Office of Program Planning, Analysis, and Development. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure today to introduce Dorothy Stoneman and J.B. Schramm. Dorothy, as you can read from her biography, is the founder and president of YouthBuild USA. I think most important in many ways for today's conversation is that she's got a lot of experience with grassroots organizations at the community level, working with youth and community development, and has managed to take a wonderful idea and a wonderful program and take it to scale across the country. Likewise, J.B., who is the founder and CEO of the College Summit, started in the community working with youth and building on his recognition that youth who were capable of college really weren't thinking about it, didn't know how to go about getting into college, preparing the applications, or even selecting a college, started the College Summit, which now since works with thousands of to move them from high school to college. I think over the last decade or so, in a lot of the, particularly brain research and other research, we've learned a great deal about the enormous potential for development and change in adolescents and young adults. We now know that this is the second big spurt of brain development and opportunities to really change the course of the lives of youth in ways that are both biologically based as well as socially and attitudinally. Both Dorothy and J.B. have come up with very creative ideas about how to work with these youth and have been very successful. The topic for today is, how do you take a really good idea and take it to scale? Who do you work with? How do you work with government? How do you work with others? And secondly, I think in today's environment, which demands evidence, how do you innovate and know that what you're doing is really effective? So Dorothy, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I'm delighted to start. I have some PowerPoints here to start. Good. Okay, so this is a picture of young people in YouthBuild celebrating the 30th anniversary of the YouthBuild program, which started in 1978 in East Harlem. Now, how do I move to the next one again? There it is, and then to the next one. This is where we started in East Harlem. We started with the belief that we needed to build a movement of young people who were currently idle and not employed or in school to begin to lift their voices up and to take a responsible role in their communities. And so they said they would like to rebuild the houses in their communities and they would like to go back to school. So we built a program around their desires and evolved it over time to add the other elements that mattered to them. So there is, let's see, I still don't know quite how to move this. Thank you. So there is a combination of several prime components in the YouthBuild program. One is that young people who are 16 to 24 and who are out of school or out of work enroll full-time for a year, roughly, during which they spend half their time building affordable housing and the other half working toward their high school diploma or their GED, and it's all knit together with a very strong peer positive culture with adults who care deeply about them and demonstrate it in many ways, and who provide personal counseling and case management, and a big emphasis on leadership development with the idea that they can make a difference in their community. We're not just training them to become, obedient employees. We are positioning them to become change agents and leaders in their own communities. And this is a little picture of those 5 components. Somebody else is moving these for me because I still haven't figured this out. So let's move to the next. With this kind of comprehensive program, we do attract the most disadvantaged young people, 100% low income and 92% without a high school diploma, 72% young men. Let's move to the next. And the core values that we believe in, that we inculcate into those components, is a belief in the power of love and in responsibility for work and community, for gaining knowledge, for treating everyone, including oneself, with profound respect. Next slide. Now, we measure outcomes consistently. Right from the beginning, we said we're going to have to measure both who comes in and who achieves what. So these are aggregate outcomes over a period of time, that of these 92% have left high school without a diploma, 64% complete the program, and 53% then earn their GED or diploma, 69 going on. And then you also have to measure long-term impacts, not just what happens in the short term. So we have tried to measure those. We have not yet, although one is just beginning, had the random assignment evaluation that people say is the most important one to have ultimately. But we were looking right from the beginning for ways to build our own capacity to define, measure, and track outcomes over time, because sometimes those evaluations, they're like one moment in time. And it's an up or down vote on whether you've made a difference or not. But you've got to internalize what it is you really want to achieve and what you want to measure and build it into what you're doing. Next slide. Now, Julie said at the beginning that we had taken a program to scale. Well, we have gone from one program in East Harlem that started in 1978 to 273 across the country in rural and urban communities with 10,000 young people a year in the program. We don't consider that scale. We consider that partial scale, because there are 2 million eligible young people, and we're turning away thousands of young people in each location, and there are 1,800 organizations who have applied to the federal government to bring YouthBuild programs to their community. So there's way more need, way more capacity, and we will call it full scale when we reach the limit of either the demand or the capacity, and we're nowhere near that limit. However, and so to get to that limit, we're going to have to continue to do what this picture shows, which is advocate on Capitol Hill to open the doors to other youth, and these are YouthBuild students in their annual visit to Capitol Hill. Now, you know, it isn't magic. It's very hard work to go from one program to 273 over a 30-year period. And it was really, we laid out a 16-point plan back in the beginning, but it wasn't a traditional business plan. We just figured out, what are we going to have to do here? You know, we're going to have to prove it works. We're going to have to get allies. We're going to have to get champions. We're going to have press. We're going to have to get private funds. We're going to have to do evaluation. We're going to have to build a constituency that can speak. We're going to have to keep making it better and better. We're going to have to learn how to replicate it. We're going to have to write the handbooks, and we're going to have to make the films that can communicate what are the key elements of this that make it work. And each step along the way, we had to be doing all of those things simultaneously. And then, of course, in figuring out how you're going to work with government, and you really have to work with government, because no matter how good your idea is, no matter how great it is, if you don't access the primary source of funding, you can't grow beyond a small number of people. And so if your goal is to really solve a problem, you've got to do it with government resources and in partnership with government entities at either or all the local, state, and federal levels. And that is a complex, endless negotiation, because first comes the persuasion, right? And so to do that, first we did it in New York City, and we built a coalition in New York of about 150 organizations, and we brought young people to speak out at all the public hearings on the budget, and you have to both persuade the legislators and the agencies. So the administering agencies and the legislators and the executive, all three parts of the implementation picture are important, that you get them on board, that they are persuaded that this is a good thing and that they understand it and want to see it replicated. So we did all that work in New York City, but we had young people speaking out, and that's always been a key part of what we've done, is to lift up the voices of people who are low income themselves and who can tell the story. So I think we succeeded in 1984 in persuading the city government to put first $5 million and then $12 million into replicating this program. And then I'll fast forward, because our introductory time is limited, to 1992, when we succeeded again on the federal level in persuading the federal government, because we had champions. John Kerry, Major Owens introduced legislation that we helped to write, and it was passed, and an appropriation was obtained to start on a federal level with $40 million to replicate YouthBuild nationwide. That was in 92, and it's taken 18 years since then to steadily build the constituency, the broad-based bipartisan support, the proof in various forms of evaluation, to get up above $100 million a year, because everything is very incremental. And all the way, we've had to work very closely through complex negotiations with federal agencies, because we essentially gave our program to first to HUD, and then it was transferred to the Department of Labor, gave them the template, the boilerplate, the power to replicate it, and then we now serve as training and technical assistance providers to their grantees. The money does not flow through YouthBuild USA, although a lot of people imagine that it does. So I'm sure we'll come back after JB has had a chance to speak to what's really the nature of a public-private partnership, because we can only solve these problems together. We can only do it if the grassroots, the community-based, and the constituencies themselves are linked to the power of government and the authority and the resources of government to move it in a big way. So that's my introduction.
Dorothy.
Oh, wait. No, go ahead.
Before we go to JB, one of the questions that's come through has to do with funding. What is the budget for, if there is one, for a typical YouthBuild operation in a city? And how much of that money is local, how much of it is federal, and how much of it is private?
Well, that's a good question. So we say a typical budget for a beginning program with 35 students is about $700,000. If about 75% of that comes from the federal government, if the organization is successful in obtaining the federal funds, and anotder 25% locally. But then as the program grows, the federal amount does not grow, so some of them become charter schools and multiply from 30 students slowly over time to 200 students, and that's supported by average daily attendance funds. Or they tap into other Workforce Investment Act funds or CDBG funds or criminal justice funds. In some states, the criminal justice system is fully funding anyone who's engaged in the criminal justice system for their time in the YouthBuild program. So it is quite a complicated puzzle to put together the full funding for a local program. And if they don't get full funding, they can still be licensed from the federal government. They can still be licensed by YouthBuild USA to be a YouthBuild program if they can figure out how to raise the program from other sources, raise the funds from other sources.
Okay, thank you.
So it costs about $20,000 to $22,000 per person per year, and that includes the fact that we pay stipends and wages to the young people for the work they do producing affordable housing in their communities. And of course, that's part of the transformational piece of this. The young people who've been on the streets, hanging out or dealing drugs or just being lost, now are seen and see themselves as producers of this incredibly valuable commodity in their community, affordable housing, and everyone sees them do it.
Thank you. JB.
Yes, Julie, I was getting off of mute. It's great to follow you, Dorothy. Dorothy's just been such a trailblazer in the social change space around thinking through policy and government funding. So we've been learning from you for a long time. So it's always good to hear you describe what you're doing.
Thank you.
To move the slides, should I just go, is it thumbnails that I go through?
Yes.
Okay, great. And do you see a new slide here?
Agenda?
Yes. Okay, so what I want to quickly do is just give you a little background on College Summit, then describe a particular policy story that we have, and then some of the lessons that we've learned. College Summit is trying to address the issue that the President and Secretary Duncan have said is our number one education goal over the next 10 years, which is to become number one in the world again in college attainment by 2020. And what we help public schools do is ask two questions. First question is, why do young people work hard in high school? And what we have learned through our students, through the parents, through the educators, is that today, young people are not motivated by a high school diploma. There may have been a time that was in motivation and incentive, but it's not today. And when young people are working hard in high school, it's because they're thinking about their future. A better job, more money, better college, better life. And so what we help public schools do is help students connect the dots between those future goals that they have and those decisions they make day to day about going to math class and doing their homework and so forth. So that's the first question we help schools work on. And the second question is, who's most influential to a 17-year-old? And what we have learned is that it's not the teacher, and it's not actually the parents. It's usually the peers. It's the friends. It's the social network. And so we help schools use a peer-to-peer influence model, working through the social network of the students, really embracing the idea that young people are not vessels that get education poured into them, but they are, and especially when they're in high school, They're drivers of culture, drivers of the norms of the school and of the education there. So we help schools tap the young people to drive a college-going culture in the school. You can see we're working this year with 25,000 students in 180 high schools. What we do in those schools practically is we help them measure where their students go after high school for the first time, so that the principal and the educators and the student influencers can say the purpose of our high school is college and career success, and they can measure it and see if they're making progress. Second thing we do is we help schools shift from the norm in American high schools, which is a some kids approach to high school or to post-secondary planning, where we have a counseling office or an info center, and some kids opt to go down there and get support. And we help the schools say, no, it's an all-kids approach, so that they provide a post-secondary planning course for every student, so that every student is seeing where they want to go and making a plan. Third thing we do is we help train the teachers, not just the counselors, but the teachers have to be part of this solution, and they need to be supported if they can help build this culture. And then finally, we help them find the most influential students in the school, and we train them through 4-day residential programs held on college campuses to go into their school and drive the culture shift through their classmates and through younger students. You can see that we've got an independent evaluation finding an 18% increase in college enrollment rate for participants across our schools. This was a time series evaluation, which is a fancy way of saying a before and after view of our schools, using data that is almost public, or close to public, from the National Student Clearinghouse, which has data on 93% of students in college around the country. And then in terms of persistence in college, we're seeing a 79% persistence rate to second year, which is the big hurdle on the path to graduation. And that rate is on par with persistence rates for students from all income levels, including upper income levels. So that's a bit of background on College Summit. And I'll now try to see if I can keep moving down the path here. So let me tell you a story. So for years, we were talking with superintendents and principals, and they would tell us, I care about what my student does when they leave high school, but I'm not measured on it, and I'm measured on a lot of other things, and so I just frankly can't put much attention to their post-secondary outcomes. And this is in spite of the fact that poll after poll, including one we did with Deloitte this past year, has found that for parents and young people in lower-income communities, they see the number one purpose of high school as being college success. So even though that's what the parents want and that's what the students want, the schools just can't focus much on it. So we went around to Capitol Hill and found some allies who believe that, high schools really should start knowing how their students are doing after high school. And in the Higher Education Act a year and a half ago, there was language signed into law calling for high schools for the first time ever to learn what their students are doing in terms of college enrollment following high school. And so, that was the transparency point that's so important. We then said, let's take a look at this a bit deeper. And in partnership with the Aspen Institute and the Center for American Progress, we did a couple white papers, and I've got the links up here in case any of you want to take a look at them. They were about defining high schools as not destinations, but launch pads to college and career success. And then taking a look at how can we have not only transparency about what our students are doing, but how can we say that if a high school is sending more students to college who not only go to college, but pass their courses beyond remediation in college, that school's doing a good job, and that school is making progress. And we were thrilled that Race to the Top, in its definition of the 5 state success factors that are the outcomes that states are being charged with driving towards, the department accepted 2 post-secondary outcomes, college enrollment rate and credit accumulation. And credit accumulation is completion of a year of college coursework beyond remediation. And the department used those two post-secondary metrics along with the traditional metrics around high school graduation and math and verbal achievement and for closing the achievement gap in Race to the Top. And also we were pleased that the department put into the Recovery Act a really important infrastructure piece of the puzzle, which was to require that states getting Recovery Act dollars build state longitudinal data systems that had the capacity, among other things, to track college enrollment and credit accumulation at the student school level. So there's been a lot of progress on this, and the Obama administration, the progress in here has been bipartisan. So there was bipartisan support on HEOA. President Bush signed into law the transparency provision in HEOA. And then under President Obama, the progress on this has been dizzying. Secretary Duncan is just a real believer in these issues from his time in Chicago when he was a real innovator around these. And you probably noticed his speech a week ago on the high school, and his opening paragraph was making the case that the culture of high schools must be changed to support success beyond K-12, and he said high schools can no longer be destinations. They need to be launching pads for student success post-secondary. So there's a lot of momentum around here. And I think you can see this is an approach for shifting the field that has financial implications. If schools are driving towards this, they are going to be looking for solutions internally, externally, from all sources. And it was a real belief on our part that the most important thing we could do for our field was to get really clear on what results students needed. And so we've had a real focus in our policy efforts around having a new measure of success defined for high schools. It's really been 100 years since policy decided that, policymakers started saying that the purpose of high school is high school diplomas. And it's time for a higher purpose. And we felt that was the most important way that we, with our very limited bandwidth, could contribute. And we're pleased to see there's some progress in this vein, but there is a long way to go towards making this the norm in high schools. Finally, I'll share a couple of lessons that we've learned. First is what I've been talking about right now, which is getting clarity on the lever. Each of us in our organizations are trying to think, how can we improve the opportunities for young people and our communities? What is that lever that your organization has the capacity to have an influence on? And so we've found a lot of value in getting focused and clarity on what that lever is. And for us, it was around post-secondary outcomes. Second point is around relationships. Dorothy is a master of building the relationships at different levels in government and in different departments. But we've seen that lesson bear fruit time and time again. And it's not just relationships, but it's bipartisan relationships. I think most of us work in areas where there can be built real consensus across the aisle on the importance of the work we're doing. And I think that's really important. We found strategic alliances, just for example, with the Aspen Institute and CAP being really helpful. And figuring out who can help move your issue forward, who can do things better than you can, and ally with them. And then the final point about, on the one hand, there's tremendous urgency at each step in the process, and we have to convey that to policymakers, to constituents. And at the same time, you got to be patient. Dorothy described a 30-year journey, and our journey's been more like 15 years. But this is you got to have the stomach for a long-term approach if you're going to really shift some of the measures and some of the definitions of success through policy. So with that, I'll close.
Thank you. We're beginning to get some questions from people who are listening, and while those are still coming in, I'd like to ask you, you did a very good summary at the end, JB, of what you've been learning along the way. Dorothy and JB, what have you learned specifically about working with government, and how have you changed the way you work with state, local, and the federal government? And what happens to the innovativeness of your ideas when there's buy-in with these larger agencies that are then responsible for perpetuating it?
That's a question worthy of a book. I'll do my best in a minute or two. First of all, the goal is to really come up with a partnership, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you turn over your program for implementation by the government, there's a power relationship that has to be understood, and that is that, the government controls its resources and is accountable for its own outcomes and for financial management, and so it is going to take charge. And you need to be able to work with humility and in a subordinate role at the same time as you continue to maintain your role as primary advocate and somebody who's trying to orchestrate the whole scene in a way that is both deferential and influential. Not always easy. And then the actual relationship between the government and the nonprofit is interesting, because the government agencies and the nonprofit entities have very different requirements, different cultures, assets, weaknesses, blind spots, different levels of authority, and so the art of leveraging each other's strengths and balancing each other's weaknesses is the challenge. And plus, the government is always changing. So we've worked through 4 different administrations. So, the political appointees change, the dominance in Congress changes, the civil servants tend to be more stable, but they don't have as much overt power. They have a lot of power in reality, so you have to be able to relate from top to bottom and bottom to top. And then the government has the power, the nonprofit has the agility. The government has broad experience and systems of accountability. The nonprofit has methods of building passionate commitment that tend to exceed what the government does. The government has the money, but the nonprofit has its finger on the need. The government can be slow and unwieldy. It can impose excessive burdens. It can make small mistakes that are magnified by scale, and it can leave gaps that are hard to fill. That's always becomes the nonprofit's role to try and fill those gaps and find other resources to fill those gaps, or to create a cutting edge of continued innovation when the bureaucracy has created its structured systems of accountability. But the nonprofit can be understaffed, stretched too thin, not focused on documenting its work adequately. Government subject to sudden changes in goals and methods based on political ideology and power shifts. It goes on and on, which is one reason why it helps to have a very stable structure in the nonprofit, where you become the memory. You become the holder of the torch no matter what kind of changes the government goes through. I think that has worked well for us. But you also become the communicator of the essence over and over and over and over again. So I'll stop there in my minute.
JB, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Dorothy did a good job.
Okay. Several questions have come in about how the economic downturn, and particularly for YouthBuild, the problems in the housing market have affected what you're doing. And I would add to that how you change your marketing, your political advocacy as the economy changes.
I'll answer that in a second. I have an additional point to make in my previous comment, and that is, the best thing you can do is create these marvelous partnerships with people inside whatever government agency you're working with. the first person to run the YouthBuild program in the federal government in HUD is now the chairman of the board of YouthBuild USA. After he left government, he was still devoted to YouthBuild. If you can get that level of partnership, then everything is good. So your other question, it's been hard, the downturn in housing in some ways. What it means is that some of the programs that have made that are community development corporations that not only produce the housing but then sell it have had trouble selling it, and that's been part of their revenue stream. Some of them have had to change the type of training they do, so they're focusing more on retrofitting and weatherization, which is not the same full training as building a house from the ground up. But there's still houses being built, and we can still partner with Habitat for Humanity and with other CDCs. It hasn't brought it to a halt by any means, but there are certain programs that are saying, wow, this is really hard on us.
Mm-hmm. And JB, are you noticing any immediate impacts of the financial downturn?
Certainly school districts are getting hit harder during the budget cycle than we've seen in 15 years. And they're having to make, very tough choices. At the same time, there's an era of reform and resources for some aspects of reform that are unprecedented. So it's a mixed bag. There's some real growth going on in terms of reform and schools building new capacity. And so overall, we've actually seen growth during this period. But we're seeing this growth in the context of understanding that school districts, educators, teachers, counselors, principals are under extraordinary stress trying to deliver for young people with staffing cuts and fewer resources.
I would agree it's a mixed bag, and some things have benefited from the stimulus funds and from different priorities in the administration.
Could you talk a little bit more, JB, about some of the challenges to working with school districts, which are very much local government, and so there's enormous variation across them. As you've mentioned that they're stressed, they're under pressure, they've got multiple goals that may not necessarily align. What have you learned about how to move into or to start working with a school district and keep them collaborating with you?
I think the chief lesson is being a partner. It's the same point that Dorothy made with respect to the federal government. And for us, principals and teachers and counselors and superintendents are our core partner. And what does it mean to be a partner? Well, it means that when things are rough and there's some school district leaders or principals are under fire, that you're standing side by side and you're supporting them. And it means that you come in with an ear to what are the needs of this school at this time, and how can we support that, as opposed to coming in with a kind of a take it or leave it sort of approach. So I think just the key issue is if you can build a partnership, then you can problem solve when there's budget problems or when faculty get shifted from one school to the other on September 2nd and you're starting classes on September 4th. And it's also how you can be co-creators of a new culture in a school and in a district. So I'd say that the key issue is partnership.
Several people are writing in to point out that both of your programs make heavy use of peer-to-peer relationships as a way of transforming the lives of youth. But some are asking, do you also work with the parents?
Well, I can go first on that.
Okay.
We work, so in our communities, we help the school as well as the peer leaders engage with parent groups. Primary focus is around financial aid because that's where the rubber meets the road with respect to parental involvement and expectations with respect to post-secondary. So that's an important piece in each of our communities to engage the parents and help them, understand some of the opportunities with respect to higher education and the finances around it, as well as some of the risks, so that they can, what we say is that they don't have to have all the answers. And most of our parents haven't gone to college themselves, so they're reassured when they know they don't need to have the answers. But what their child needs is for them to be at their back and helping them ask the questions and get the answers from their schools and from the supporting organizations that are supporting them.
And for us, we have the young people who typically do not have parents at their back. And so what happens is that and they're 16 to 24, and about a third of them are already parents themselves. So we kind of view this as the right point of intervention if you're going to break the cycle of poverty. These are the young people who are about to raise the next generation in poverty, and we sort of address them as future parents. But then really what we do is pull their parents in at the point where they have something to be proud of. You can't imagine how healing it is for parents who had given up on their children or who had not been involved with their children one way or another, to be there at graduation, seeing this young man or young woman receiving their diploma with their cap and gown, and you see parents weeping and being thankful. So there's a healing process that brings parents in, not so much in the ongoing process, but as the culmination. And then going forward, the young people tend to become strong members in their families, supporting their own parents and being a resource for their parents. I want to say something about the concept of the culture. JB has referred to the school culture. We put a big emphasis on the program culture because if you can't replace the culture of the streets with a positive sense of mutual support where young people feel safe and they respect each other and they feel respected and they care about each other's success, it doesn't work. So engaging teachers, when we work with teachers in our schools also, but engaging the entire staff in the inculcation of values and a style of operating that is different from anything that young people have experienced before is really key.
And do you train staff at WorkBuild sites across the country to try to build in this culture?
Yes.
Okay, and JB, you said earlier that you also work with the teachers and the folks in the school, bringing training into them. Is that correct?
That's right. We run academies where we train the teachers, and then our staff are in the school every 2 weeks doing embedded on-site professional development.
Which gets back to your earlier point about really being partners through the long haul. You're with them regularly.
JB, are your staff in the school, in all 185 schools every 2 weeks?
That's right. So
That's
we
awesome.
we have in each of our regions local coaches who get to the schools every 2 weeks and look at data and help problem solve with the educators and the principals and the counselors on how to build that culture and help more students make progress.
And is that privately funded or publicly? The coaching process.
That piece ends up being that's a piece that is funded through the schools, but we get a significant percentage of our dollars. So schools pay a fee, but also philanthropy pays a significantly larger chunk of the overall cost.
And that's an important point, that private funding is critical in this mix. The private funding that provides the grease and the innovation and that fills the gaps. And so having private philanthropic partners who understand that just because you have achieved public funding or you're working with a public partner, that doesn't mean that it's time for philanthropy to step out.
Yeah, the private funding, for us has been, of course, the seed funding, but also as we progress, the innovations, and I think that's a key theme of this larger conversation that we're a part of here, is around innovation. And how can you get the resources to try some cutting-edge experiments, even those that involve some risk. And I think that's as we're looking at with an increasing interest on the part of the federal government in funding initiatives that work, how can we think of the role of private dollars to encourage and support the large federal commitment of resources, but also to make sure that we are keeping these organizations that have been innovative on the innovative edge. And when there's work to be done with federal dollars, as Dorothy mentioned, there's a real attention that has to be paid to the accountability issues and documentation of activities and so forth. And that's not the easiest space for innovation, at least cutting-edge innovation. And that's something where we really need the role of private dollars. And we're working on some innovations now that we think are as exciting as some of the core work that's getting federal attention. But it's way too early for federal resources to go to these experimental ideas, and that's the great opportunity for private sources.
There's also potential for building into public sources funding for innovation. It's hard to sustain it, but there are possibilities, and so we also try to do that. And then one other piece is that once there's a federal program that has a required non-federal match, that can create a problem because sometimes the requirements that are made on the federal money are made on the match as well, so that inhibits the use of it for innovation. So there's a lot of sort of fine points in the line between public and private funds, which is worthy of a lot of exploration.
Dorothy, earlier you said that you had gone partially to scale. So I have a question for both of you, which is, what do you need to really expand what you're doing into more cities, more school districts?
Well, we're working on a growth plan to get to $1 billion of federal funds, $250 million of state criminal justice and education funds, and $80 million of private growth capital that together would take us to 50,000 young people a year in 800 communities. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not easy to get to. How to get from $100 million to $1 billion a year of federal funds under the current circumstances is kind of like, are you kidding me? But, you have to put a stake in the ground. And President Obama embraced this vision in his campaign. Then he faces a variety of other realities in his administration. But if you as the advocate don't continue to put a stake in the ground and keep moving toward it, and at the same time be able to deal with reality, things will not move. But that is our vision, is to get to 50,000, and at that point we don't know whether there would be another 50,000 we'd be turning away, and if so, there would be another stage of growth. But if 50,000 satisfies the demand, well, then we'll relax and meet the demand.
J.B.?
We've designed a 5-year plan that we are raising the growth capital to support, and what we are setting out to do is to serve by year 5, 60,000 students per year, and to do that with even higher outcomes in terms of college going and persistence rates, and to through this process develop enough local philanthropic and school district funding support so that at that point we'll be able to continue serving those 60,000 students year in and year out without the need for additional growth capital. And we are raising $45 million to fund this 5-year plan, and we are half the way there after 9 months of work. And so we're seeing some good momentum, but we've got a large, big chunk to go and some matching dollars that are sitting that we need to get matched to really leverage.
J.B., I know you have to run off to a meeting, so maybe you can start answering this next next question, but people are writing in to point out that there are outcome evaluations, and you've given some very important information about where you've been successful in your programs, but wanting to know if you've written any papers that deal with what are the steps along the way, what's the process, and what have you learned about the process of developing new programs, innovating, and expanding them?
That's a great question about taking the time to reflect and write it down. I think the biggest story for us has been a decision fairly early on to invest a lot in performance management and outcome data tracking ourselves. So what we're trying to do is to create as much as possible a learning culture where we can be looking at student outcomes based on data from state data systems as well as the National Student Clearinghouse, and tying that data to the input data, so the work in the schools as well as the output data, what students' grades, students' application rates, and financial aid forms and so forth. So we've seen we've benefited from work that Deloitte's been a big supporter of in terms of building a data warehouse, so we can do some analytics ourselves and not learn every 5 years when we do a formal evaluation, and we're doing that too. But we want to have as much as possible on every one of our schools, every one of our students, outcome conversations every year, and I think that's been a smart strategic decision on our part.
Dorothy?
I echo that. I think the internal learning culture is absolutely essential, and then, of course, there's external independent evaluations that you have to engage in as well. It's really ongoing, and at any given point, you need to figure out, well, what do we need to learn now? So at a certain point, we said to ourselves, well, we need to figure out what's really happened to the graduates of YouthBuild programs. We hear, it looks very good. They finish, they go to college, they get jobs, but what happens a few years out? And so we contracted with Brandeis University to find and study 800 graduates and 7 years out, or up to 7 years out, and then we were reassured that what was happening was excellent and that they weren't losing their gains, and that 75% of them were in college or employed at average of $10 an hour. And so, then we move forward we continue our internal data management and figure out what the next external evaluation is. I think there was a question asked that I saw on here about have there been external papers written on how you go to scale, and I think there are quite a few. The Duke Fuqua School of Business did a study on YouthBuild's going to scale, which can be found on our website, probably on their website too, but ours is youthbuild.org. Happen to know it. And I think that there are other organizations which have done studies on a variety of organizations that have gone to what I call partial scale.
J.B. and Dorothy, I want to thank you very much. This has been an inspiring hour, and we wish both of you and your initiatives a great deal of success.
Well, we're both having a lot of fun, and I recommend to anyone who wants to go down this path that it's exciting, challenging, and you get constant feedback from people who've participated about how much it's benefited them, and that makes life very satisfying.
Well, thank you again, Dorothy. It really is a treat to have you and JB, and I want to thank Julie Wilson, our moderator, as well. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I just wanted to remind folks that we will have the slides, including the links, and we'll try to track down the paper from the Duke University Fuqua School. And we have some other resources up also, and you can find those on the landing page of this web chat. Thanks again, everybody. Have a nice afternoon.